Grief can do some strange things to people. That's what I was always told, anyway. My mom first told me that when one of my high school friends lost her sister and started dressing up and acting like her sister. It made sense to me then, and I went out of my way to befriend her. Now, we're still close BFFs to this day, incidentally, and that's relevant to the story because she's a bit of a Let's Read fangirl, and she's the one who encouraged me to write in with this tale. Now, don't worry, she won't mind that I've included the personal little bit about her. She's proofreading and approving the whole thing, by the way. Now, this incident happened when I was 19. I've taken a year out after high school before going to college so I could work and put together some savings to avoid my student loans from being sky high. It didn't really work, but at least I tried. Now, this was back in I think maybe 2012 when Facebook was still really popular. We had a local neighborhood watch. I wasn't really a member as such. I didn't go to meetings or get involved, but I was their honorary mascot, which meant that I was a member of the Facebook group. Now, one day, I logged on to find the group totally abuzz. A whole bunch of the neighbors had witnessed something straight out of a horror movie, apparently. As the previous night, an elderly woman had been walking up and down the street, pushing an industrial-style shopping cart. No harm done, right? Well, the shopping cart contained a full-sized coffin. And she wasn't just walking down the street once. She was walking down the street, disappearing for a while, and then walking back the way she came. One of the neighbors, a night owl guy that I knew, his name was James, decided to follow her at a distance. He discovered that she had been walking in a circle around a few blocks and then turning around at a certain point and repeating the circuit in reverse. Everyone's posts were rife with speculation. Why was she carting a coffin around? Was that even legal? Apparently it looked like a fairly battered, dirty coffin, and some of the theories were wild. Now, it took me, a 19-year-old girl, to provide a grounded suggestion. It was a Halloween prop. It was the start of October, so it wasn't out of the ordinary. Now, James immediately shot my idea down. I hadn't seen her. Why would this extremely elderly lady be walking a circuit around the block with a spirit Halloween coffin in a shopping cart? That's a good point, James, but had he considered dementia? Maybe the old lady lived on the next street over and she was suffering from sundown syndrome, which causes dementia sufferers to start acting weird right after nightfall. It was as good an explanation as any. But whatever. It had happened, it was over, and I guess we'd never know, I said. But wrong. I was very wrong. And the next night, the old woman was back, walking her little loops, and this time, James called me up. Now, I'm sure he'd been waiting for an excuse to call me. The guy actually did have a crush on me since middle school, and he told me to look out my window. Now, sure enough, the old woman was there, and she was really, really old. I was amazed that she had the strength to push a shopping cart around at all, let alone one with a coffin in it. And she wasn't pushing it slowly either. She was striding around like a woman half her age. Now, one thing I noticed that nobody else had seemed to pick up on was that this coffin really did not look like some spirit Halloween prop. If so, it was the most realistic prop I'd ever seen, and it looked a lot more like a film or TV prop than anything else. At least it couldn't be a real coffin, could it? Now, this whole fiasco went on for another few days. I was on vacation from work, so I was happy to play night owl for a while, and then, that Sunday night, the elderly woman didn't show up. I breathed a sigh of relief, and perhaps this was the end of it. No. The next day, Monday, she was back, and I couldn't help but notice that the coffin was starting to look a little worse for the wear. It had been raining almost constantly for a week, mostly some light rain, but heavier in the daytime, and I wondered if she'd been storing the coffin outside because it certainly looked like the wood was starting to get mold and splinter a little bit. Tuesday came and went, and I saw her again. Now the old woman was starting to fall apart. I really started to pay attention to her appearance. She looked almost confused and scared. Her gait, which had been strong to start with, was really starting to falter, and I was beginning to be more and more convinced that this was dementia. Now, the rest of the neighborhood watch seemed hesitant to get involved, even James. I think he even spooked them out a little. When I kept insisting that we should do something, the adults kept telling me to leave it. She wasn't doing any harm, and there must be a good explanation for it. Now, a far cry from the first night, which had set the whole of the neighborhood watch abuzz. On Wednesday, the woman was really struggling. I'd become used to her role by now, and by my reckoning, it was taking her about twice as long to do her route. Now on Thursday, she was struggling even further because one of the wheels on her shopping cart had gone all gimpy, and she really had to struggle to keep it straight. On Friday night, I decided I was going to go outside and actually approach her. Now, my parents were away for the weekend. I didn't tell anyone about what I was going to do, as she was an elderly woman who must have been in at least her mid-80s. What was the worst she could do? And so I left my house shortly before I knew that she'd show up and pretended I was outside having a smoke, and I bumped into her by complete accident. It was very clear to me that she was confused. She kept calling me Gloria, which isn't even slightly my name, but eventually I managed to persuade her to open up, and the story she told me was heartbreaking and tragic. The old woman used to live somewhere around here with her husband many years ago. He'd passed sometime in the 80s, and they'd frequently gone for evening walks around the block, and she had it in her mind that if she started taking those long walks again, she might be able to reconnect with him. At first, her story brought me to tears. The whole thing was so tragic, and she reminded me much of my great-grandma, who had succumbed to Alzheimer's when I was younger, and I wanted to hug the old woman, who told me her name was Ethel, but it felt like it'd be intrusive. Now, I was so focused on the story that she told me that I almost forgot about the coffin itself, and suddenly it struck me. She was walking the neighborhood to reconnect with her husband, but she was carting this coffin around. It couldn't be, could it? I allowed myself to actually look at the coffin. Now, I'd been avoiding looking the whole time, as I suspected that the wood had started rotting in places, and there were a couple of holes in the coffin lid that had led me into the interior. Thankfully, I couldn't see much, but I could see enough. There definitely was some type of bones in that coffin. My hands started shaking, and I told Ethel to wait where she was because I wanted to help her, and then I stepped away a little, called 911, and whispered to the dispatch about what was happening. I told them that if they send the cops, please don't send them with sirens because she's a very old, vulnerable woman, and I didn't want to give her a heart attack or anything. However, it wasn't Ethel who risked having a heart attack. When I turned back to comfort her, I was absolutely horrified to see that she had opened the coffin. Years in the ground had not done her husband justice. It was mostly bones, with patches of shriveled skin in places. His clothes had all rotted off, and one thing that stuck with me was that his scalp was partially intact and strands of hair hung down one side of his skeletal face. I almost screamed then and ran, but I didn't want to startle Ethel. She seemed so proud to be showing off her husband, as if opening the coffin to show me had suddenly reunited her with her beloved. It's very strange, this feeling of terror and revulsion and grief and sympathy all at once, but I can safely say that I've experienced that combination. I talked to Ethel for a few minutes, trying to keep my eyes off the corpse next to us, which holy hell did it reek, when the cops pulled in without the sirens on as I requested, and I was unbelievably relieved. Everything was quiet, controlled chaos after that. They took poor Ethel away in a police car and she stayed fully silent. They called a coroner to come for the coffin and the body, and meanwhile, it all suddenly hit me and I started shivering and convulsing in shock, so I was actually carted off to a hospital eventually. It turned out that Ethel's husband's coffin had been stolen 5 years ago. Ethel was 93 at the time that I met her. It was very clear to all of us that an 88-year-old woman was not capable of exhuming a coffin and transporting it out of a graveyard. Whoever helped her has, as far as I'm aware, still never been identified. Ethel fell into a catatonic state immediately following the events. She spent some months in a nursing home, during which I visited her at least twice a week. Now, eventually pneumonia took her, and I hope she's finally reunited with her husband, who I found out was named Clive. Thankfully, I was able to find some photos of him with Ethel in her room that her granddaughter had brought for her, and it was much better a way to picture Clive than the rotting, decomposing corpse he'd been when we first met. Now, I don't think I'll ever get that sight out of my head. It was horrific, tragic, and a terrifying series of events, but it did make for one heck of a story for the Neighborhood Watch Facebook group. Do you like fire, Joel? I used to. I used to enjoy bonfires and campfires. I used to love staring into the flames and imagining I could see all kinds of magical things in them. Now, fire just fills me with fear. Not just because of one event, but because of two. They occurred a few months apart, but they are almost certainly linked. The first event happened when I was walking home from town one day. I live within walking distance of the shopping district. Yay for the UK and its tiny landmass, so walking into town was a weekly trip for me. I live in a no-through terrace street with footpaths on one end. One leads from the town/train station, and the other leads to the suburbs and further out of town. I was walking down the footpath leading to my street when I noticed a group of 3 very drunk, very loud people just ahead of me. 2 men and a woman. I could hear them over the sounds of Rammstein playing through my headphones, but I shut off my iPhone so I could hear them clearer. They were some of the most vulgar, unpleasant people I have ever had the misfortune to follow, and I prayed that they didn't stop, turn around, and see me. They were clearly 50,000 sheets to the wind, and from the sounds of their jabbering, they were looking for a fight with someone. Anyone, probably. Thankfully, they were too focused on heading to wherever to stop and turn around. As I reached the turning into my street, they crossed over to the next footpath. I watched with disgust as one of them tossed a cigarette butt into the hedge of my neighbor at the end of the street. And as soon as I got home and unpacked my shopping, I headed upstairs and checked out the window. I was a little concerned about the discarded cigarette butt because it was a dry summer and the hedge had started turning brown and dry. And before I even had a chance to scope out the end of the street, I knew something was up. It looked like it was snowing, in August, and I quickly realized that ash was blowing past my window. I quickly looked out to the right and saw that flames were licking up my neighbor's hedge. I grabbed my phone and called a couple of neighbors, ones that I knew were members of the neighborhood watch, and then I immediately ran outside. Before I even had a chance to get halfway down the street, the entire hedge, and I'm talking an extremely large, deciduous hedge here, had caught fully ablaze. Other neighbors started emerging from their houses, and we felt helpless as we realized that there was pretty much no way to get any kind of water towards the hedge. A bunch of us had called the fire brigade, but we had to watch in horror as the fire spread across the garden and caused the large tree in the center of my neighbor's front garden to suddenly erupt into flames. Now, it seemed like it took mere seconds for the tree to turn into a smoldering, blackened trunk and dead branches. Thankfully, that killed this part of the fire, but there was still the hedge to contend with, and with the danger of the fire spreading to the house. Thankfully, the fire brigade got there and managed to control the blaze. Once things had calmed down, I drew one of the firemen aside and told him about the trio that I'd seen tossing a potentially lit cigarette butt into the hedge, as it was clear that this had caused the fire. Now, to my surprise, the fireman seemed completely disinterested. In fact, he acted like I was an annoyance or like he didn't believe me. And this really infuriated me, because I guess I was a younger person at the time, and obviously young people, and when I say young, I mean mid-20s, apparently can't be taken seriously. And this event is what caused me to finally, properly join the Neighborhood Watch. I did pretty well in my first few months as a fully fledged member. I recruited other neighbors and persuaded them to join. As someone who often works nights, I kept an eye out and was able to scare off at least 1 or 2 potential vehicle vandals. I saw a guy dealing weed on the corner a few times, but I'm not that much of a narc, so I let that one be. And then, one night, I was up very late playing video games on the computer in my room at the back of the house. Now, I forget what I was playing, but it must have been something quiet because, despite wearing headphones, I was able to hear what sounded like fireworks coming from outside. Now, it wasn't remotely fireworks season, and when I heard a second bang, I realized that it sounded more like a gunshot than a firework, but not quite that either. I climbed over my bed and peered out the window. A disturbing orange glow was coming from the back garden of one of the houses on my side of the street, right at the end. Now, at first, I wasn't sure what I was seeing until I heard another explosion and a pillar of flame shot up into the air. Immediately, I called the fire brigade and then the leader of the Neighborhood Watch. I still wasn't sure which garden was on fire. My friends live at the penultimate house in the terrace, and I was worried it was their garden. I ran outside and was surprised to discover I was alone. The first thing I did was run to the end of the street, and that's when I realized that it was the side garden of the final house in the row, number 20, which was on fire. And from what I could tell, it was the garden shed, but the flames were licking dangerously towards the house itself, which was pretty dilapidated and, in particular, had a wooden balcony which could easily catch fire. I ran straight to number 19 and knocked, waking them up, and started yelling that the next door was on fire and it could spread to their house and they needed to get out of there right away. Now, as soon as I left number 19 with the family in tow, I was met by other neighbors who had also heard the commotion. A few of us had already called the fire brigade at the same time, and we were assured that they were on their way. I looked around, and I could not see the guy who lived in number 20. I assumed that he would have been first to evacuate, but no. Entering his garden was impossible, as he had a big wooden gate which was locked and would have been too slow to climb over. So in my infinite wisdom, I decided to head down the footpath that headed into town and try and yell for the guy who lived there, and also his cat, who I was very fond of. I took a few steps down from the footpath when suddenly there was another explosion from the shed. A huge, billowing wall of flame rolled over the wall and came thundering towards me, and the fire got so close to me that it singed my eyebrows and the hairs on my arms. I jumped backwards. If I had taken one single step forwards, I would have been hit by that wall of flame. Now I'm certain that someone was looking out for me that day because I was so close to being immolated that, damn, it's honestly scary to even think about to this day. Now the first brigade showed up and then the cops. And when the fire was put out and all the commotion had died down and some time had passed, we eventually discovered through our neighborhood watch liaison that it had been an act of arson. Someone had set the neighbor's shed on fire. Unfortunately, the neighbor had been storing a whole bunch of aerosol cans and fuel in his shed, which he really wasn't supposed to do, which had led to the fire being far more serious than was likely intended and far more dangerous. The reason that the owner hadn't fled the house was because he was actually away, staying with his son up country, and you'll be pleased to know that the cat was fine and was the first to flee. Now I can't be sure, but I'm absolutely certain that the trio who set the fire to the hedge were also the ones who burned the shed. When they'd been walking past number 20, some of their vulgarity had been directed at the man who lived there in the house, so they clearly knew him, and there was a nearby pub which had CCTV cameras, and of course it wasn't working at the time, so nobody was identified. The arsonist or arsonists were never caught, but I know who it was. It was the drunk alcoholic smokers who recklessly threw burning cigarette butts around, and so just after our street had stopped stinking of a burning hedge, it started stinking of a burning shed. That was a fun year, with the smell of burning everything permeating our lives. At least nothing else had caught fire for nearly 2 decades now, and if it does, then I'm going to leave it up to other members of the neighborhood watch to go heroically diving into those flames. I don't recommend it, and I think I exhausted my luck when I almost caught on fire the first time. But you know, if I'm ever forced to save a cat from the flames, I can't promise I won't dive into that inferno again. I lived with my family on Redacted Street for a few years. It was a close-knit, lovely community full of diversity and friendship, and a whole bunch of us became fast friends, and we'd regularly host barbecues and get-togethers at each other's places. The guys, me included, would often watch football regularly, and we'd generally just have a good time. And that's why it made total sense to set up a neighborhood watch. It seemed like fun at first. The neighborhood was extremely safe, and there wasn't much to really watch out for. But a bunch of us hot-blooded guys thought that it would be a badass idea, and so we went about filing the correct paperwork and completing the correct registrations. And soon, every house had one of those neighborhood watch stickers in their window, and we had a menacing sign attached to a lamppost at the opening of the street. Now, I was very impressed that absolutely everyone in the community signed up. Not surprised really, but still. Of course, nothing happened for a while. We set up a neighborhood watch email group and tested it by using it mostly for group chats. Sometimes we'd do tests. One of us would alert the others that they were going to fake an emergency, and then we would, just to test our reaction times. It was completely silly and really achieved nothing, but it was fun. And that's why I didn't take it entirely seriously when I got Mike's email to the group. Mike was the elected head of this neighborhood watch, and he was a bit of a joker. He was a serious, dependable guy when it came to it, but he was always down for a laugh. His email read like he'd either forgotten to warn us that this was a test or that he figured it was so silly he didn't even need to warn us. Now, I've still got the email archived in my old Hotmail account, and here I'll just read it for you. I've tried to fix its many typos, but Mike wasn't the best at grammar. It read as follows. Guys, there's been a sighting of something effing weird in the neighborhood. I heard from Mrs. O'Bannon and Miss Perks via 2 separate emails that they'd seen an old, withered, dirty-looking homeless guy walking down the middle of the road. Now, okay, we don't judge. Homeless people are allowed to cut through our area. That wasn't the issue, though. The guy was walking a pet on a leash, a pet alligator, according to Mrs. O'Bannon, and a crocodile, according to Miss Perks. Now, they're both willing to admit that as old ladies, they don't have the best eyesight, but they are certain that this is what they saw. Now, as you all know, we live absolutely nowhere near alligator country, and I believe crocodiles only live maybe somewhere south of Florida when it comes to mainland America, so I have no idea how this man would have a pet alligator/crocodile. Either way, be careful out there. You don't want to find yourself as reptile chow. Regards, Mike. Now immediately, I was on the phone to Mike asking if this was some kind of goof. Now, I could instantly tell that he was serious. He was skeptical, sure, like he'd said, the old ladies didn't have the best eyesight. But what other animal could they have mistaken for a crocodile or alligator? Mike and I tried to come up with some alternatives. A huge, crawling dog? Now that hardly seemed likely. A Komodo dragon? Now that would have been even worse, really. A snake? That's still not great. And after that, we were out of ideas. We knew one thing, though. The neighborhood watch had to be extra vigilant at night until we were sure that we'd seen the last of Crocodile Bum D, as we took to calling him. A pun on the movie character Crocodile Dundee for you youngsters out there. You should watch it, though. Thankfully, my kids were both at summer camp for the next month, and my wife was currently working nights at the hospital. So I was being a bit of a night owl myself to make sure that I got to spend some time with the love of my life instead of missing each other like the ships in the night. And I told Mike that I'd keep an eye out. Unsurprisingly, I saw absolutely no sign of any reptile-walking homeless guy. I did see a disheveled figure staggering down the street at 3 a.m. one night, but soon realized that it was the Petersons' teenage son, clearly drunk and clearly sneaking home. I'm pretty sure he wasn't supposed to be underage drinking, but I didn't report him though. I'm not some snitch. Now, the next night was actually a full moon. It was a beautiful night, warm without being oppressive, and the kind of night that you really didn't want to stay stuck inside on the computer. I've been neglecting my morning jogs to make sure that I was home to greet my wife, so I decided that at 1 a.m., that was a decent enough time to go quietly jogging around the neighborhood. Everyone knew I was on Crocodile Bum D watch duty, so I figured I wouldn't alarm anyone with my presence jogging around. Now, I've been jogging around for about 10-15 minutes, cursing my dad bod and feeling frustrated at the fact that I'd let myself go a little. I took a break to sort of bend down and control my breathing, and you know the way that joggers do where you rest your hands on your thighs? Well, feeling invigorated, I looked up and immediately saw a figure at the far end of the street. I was standing in the shadow of a tree, so I don't think he saw me at the time, and I watched him for a moment and then realized with horror that it was the infamous Crocodile Bum D. The old ladies that warned us about him had not done him justice. He was an absolute mountain of a man. I could see him pretty clearly because he was strolling down the road in the middle of it, lit up by streetlights on either side. And he wore this huge, filthy coat that was even taller than him, with a hem dragging along the surface of the road. And he wore these huge black boots, and I could hear his stomping footsteps even from over 200 yards away. Now, he had long, straggly hair and a wild-looking beard. I couldn't tell what race he was because of how much hair he had covering his head and face. And in between his footsteps, I heard a scraping and a sort of scuttling, too. Now, I must have seen it already, but my mind had refused to process it. The man was, as the women had said, was walking an alligator on a leash. If it hadn't been for the full moon and the streetlights, it would have been hard to see the creature in the dark. It was almost black, just sort of scraping along the street on a long leash, some distance from its menacing walker. Now, a lot of the following information I learned after the fact, but I'll just fill you in now. While the alligator looked intimidatingly big to me, it turned out to be a juvenile American alligator. And trust me, the fact that it was juvenile and was only about half its full size was a blessing. Those things can grow on average to 12 feet in length. Apparently, this one was set to be on the bigger scale, maybe as long as 14 feet, and I think I might have dropped dead of a heart attack if I was faced with a 14-foot alligator in the middle of my street in the middle of the night. Not that a 7 or 8-foot alligator was really much better, as I was just frozen there, hiding in the shadow of the tree, completely unsure of what to do or say. Now, I knew it was my duty to do something as the designated neighborhood watch reptile hunter, but holy crap, what could I do? I was not approaching that thing. But suddenly I had a stroke of genius. When we'd set up that neighborhood watch, a police liaison officer had come to talk to us about the do's and don'ts. He gave us advice on how to operate so we didn't become an armed militia, you know the things. Now, one thing he did mention is that our state, and specifically our area of the state, had adopted a fairly new system. This system basically meant that you could text to 911 instead of calling. It's a lot more common across the states now, but back when this took place, we were one of the first states to adopt it. Go North Dakota. Now naturally, I was concerned about calling 911 and alerting Crocodile Bum D, who was starting to look more threatening than the name suggested. I quickly slipped behind some tree, pulled out my creaky old smartphone out of my jogging fanny pack, and fired off a quick text to 911. Now I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was something frantic and silly like, "Giant man with an alligator walking down redacted street. Alligator is big. Man is bigger. Send help." Thankfully, as a registered member of the neighborhood watch, Mike's deputy no less, I was known to the local cops, so I figured that they wouldn't dismiss me as some prankster. Now, I was also hoping that maybe they would have received other reports about this guy, and he must have come from somewhere. I decided to wait behind the tree for Alligator Man to pass, or for the cops to show up. Unfortunately, my plan did not work out. A few moments after texting 911, I heard a sound that I swear echoes through my nightmares. Now, if you've never heard the sound of an alligator before, then lucky you. I've included a YouTube Shorts link because in case Joel wants to play the sound to illustrate exactly what I heard, but you can look it up. If you didn't play the audio or you can't hear it, then it sounds like a dragon growling. Now tell me that doesn't sound like a freaking dragon. That's what I heard that night. Now, I know in retrospect that this sound isn't actually an alligator even being aggressive, it's just the sound that they make to be curious or on alert. But in the middle of the night, as the creature and the man got closer than I realized, hearing that nearly made me poop my jogging shorts. I'm sorry for the image, but it's true. And then I heard the huge man rasp in the deepest voice I've ever heard, asking his alligator friend what she heard. Now, I'm pretty sure that he already knew he was there because he was saying things like, "Are we being watched, Princess? Is there someone up ahead, Princess, maybe behind that tree?" Now, my first thought was, no way. The alligator's called Princess. And my second thought was, I can't just keep staying hiding here. At the time, I had no idea how fast alligators really were, and I had no idea if this monster of a man was going to release Princess to chase me down if I ran. And so I did the bravest thing I could. I stepped out from behind the tree, greeted the man as cheerily as I could, and told him that I'd just been out for a late-night jog and was taking a breather. The man grunted at me in response, and Princess let out another one of those menacing bellows. Now, I knew I couldn't just say, "Nice to meet you, bye, I'm off to bed now." I didn't want Alligator Man to see where I lived, for starters, and so I decided to try and strike up a conversation with him. So, taking your gator for a walk, huh?" And the man grunted again in response. I started to ask some questions about her, like where he'd gotten her, clearly somewhere illegal, what her name was, Princess, I already knew that, all that sort of crap. And then I heard both the most blissful and terrible sound I could hear. Sirens in the distance and getting closer. The monster of a man looked at me, and the anger on his hairy, filthy face was impossible to ignore. He grunted out something accusing me of calling the cops on him, and then called Princess to his side. He began to kneel, no mean feat at his size, and I realized with horror that he was moving to unleash Princess. "Princess don't like loud noises," he said. I did not stick around to see whether he actually did unleash Princess or not. I turned tail and sprinted back to my house, which was almost the entire length of the street, and I had never ran that fast before or since. As I fumbled to get my keys into the lock, I was sure that I heard the sounds of the alligator sprinting towards me, although not that I have any idea what an alligator sprinting really sounds like. I managed to finally get my key into the lock and dive inside and kick the door shut. At the same time, I heard the sound of multiple cop cars pulling into my street and my hallway being bathed in flashing lights. I peeked out the window to see a standoff between the officers and that huge man. Thankfully, Princess was on her leash. Maybe she always had been. And it turned out that multiple people had called the cops because a pretty seriously armored animal control duo were also on the scene. One of them was holding one of those devices that let you wrangle an animal around the neck. Now, I couldn't hear exactly what was being said or yelled, but the next series of events was relieving, sure, but it was also one of the most heartbreaking things I had ever seen. I guess the cops managed to persuade the man to let animal control take charge of his alligator, because he knelt down and began to pet her as one of the animal control officers approached and, in his defense, very gently wrangled Princess around the neck. That alligator must have been the most tame alligator in existence, really, because she didn't writhe or wriggle or death roll. Instead, she almost obediently allowed animal control to guide her into the back of their wagon. Meanwhile, this probably 7-foot-tall monster of a man meekly allowed the cops to handcuff him and guide him into one of their cars. I watched as they drove off. He could barely sit up straight in the back of the cop car, he was so tall. And so this had gone from the scariest, most effed up night of my life to something that left me conflicted and kind of sad. I'm a bit of a softie when it comes to animals, and even though this massively intimidating man had an illegal, lethally dangerous pet and was taking her for a walk down my street, I couldn't help but feel bad. I guess in his eyes, Princess was no different than a dog or the many legal, dangerous exotic pets that people can keep. On the other hand, I was the absolute hero of the neighborhood watch when I told them everything that had happened. We had a meeting the next day over beers and snacks, and I was definitely the man of the hour. I still had this nagging sadness for Princess and Crocodile Bum-D, though. Thankfully, I was able to get some updates on the story over the years, and the man, whose name actually was Warren, was indeed in possession of an illegal juvenile alligator. However, as he was able to prove, he'd found her as a baby, abandoned by whoever had originally purchased her as a pet. The two had bonded, and he'd looked after her ever since. He admitted to the cops that he had no idea how large she'd grow, but accepted that she was clearly growing too big for him to manage. Princess, for the most part, had never harmed anyone or committed any crimes. Given the circumstances, nobody involved wanted to euthanize the animal, and eventually an animal sanctuary not too far away was found. The sanctuary had both the means to look after an alligator and a spare space to nurture one who hadn't acclimatized to other members of her species. Now, not only that, it was discovered that Warren had previously worked as a zookeeper many years ago, and while he'd been living homeless and unemployed for some time, he had the necessary qualifications and free time and the ability to relocate. So Princess and Warren went to live and work at the animal sanctuary together. Unfortunately, Warren passed away a couple of years ago due to cancer, but I occasionally exchange emails with the owner of the animal sanctuary, and Princess is doing extremely well. In captivity, she's looking at a good 50 or 60 more years of life, and I know that wherever he is now, Warren is looking down, watching over her. I used to be part of a neighborhood watch group, and I was witness to an absolutely crazy, kind of creepy incident that sticks with me to this day. We live on a street just on the outskirts of a small town which has a higher than average crime rate. Our street itself has always been pretty lucky, avoiding being the focus of the town's worst offenders. There was the occasional attempted break-in, some power tools stolen from a few garden sheds, but that was really it. Now, that was before this spate of car vandalism. Almost every morning, we'd wake up to discover one of our cars had been keyed or the mirrors had been slashed off. Now, in a couple of cases, the badges on the front of the couple of cars had been stolen. Now, this was back when that was a lot easier to do. One of the neighbors owned a Mercedes, and I swear his badge must have been stolen 3 times over the course of a year or so, even after we put a stop to the worst of the vandalism. Now, the vandalism is what spurred us on to start taking the neighborhood watch duties seriously. We spoke to local law enforcement, asked for the best tips we could, befriended a community officer, and got a direct line to the local station, and they also agreed to send a patrol into our cul-de-sac as many nights as possible. Now, not to belittle our boys in blue, but I don't think I ever actually saw a cop patrolling our street. I guess in fairness, they did have better things to do, like preventing murders and violent stuff in the city, so it's not like I hold it against them. And that's what the neighborhood watch was for anyway. The vandalism continued though, so about 5 or 6 of us guys volunteered to take night duty until the vandal was caught. Now surely, if we spent the next night watching the small cul-de-sac, we'd catch that person or multiple people in the act. Now that's what you'd think anyway, and yet somehow after a couple of weeks of vigilance, we didn't spot a single suspicious character. and yet the vandalism continued. It was like the culprit was Spec Ops or a ghost or something crazy. But what kind of Spec Ops soldier spends his time army crawling along the ground keying cars? I wish I could offer an explanation of who did it and how, but that was still something we never discovered. Instead, this vandalizer decided to retire himself and go out with a bang. There had been a car parked at the end of our cul-de-sac for what seemed like forever. It had clearly been abandoned there, and a number of us neighborhood watch members had stuck flyers all over the car, pleading with the owner to just move along. All the tires had deflated by this point naturally, and the paintwork was incredibly rusty. Now, we called the city council about it multiple times, but nothing was ever done. In the end, it just became sort of a staple of the street. We called the car Christine, after the Stephen King story, because it had the vague air of being haunted, or at least kind of sinister. Now, one night, it was my turn on night watch, and I was just working on my laptop looking out the window when I noticed a glow coming from the end of the cul-de-sac. My house was in the middle, so I had to look around to see exactly what it was. Immediately, I realized Christine was on fire from the inside. I ran outside, careful not to get too close, and these flames were just picking up inside of Christine's seats, but I couldn't immediately see a broken window or any way that the fire could have actually been started inside the car. I called the cops on my cell phone, so I'm glad I paused to do so because moments later, Christine exploded outward. It wasn't the kind of huge epic explosion you might see in the movies or expect from Call of Duty or something. I guess in part this was because the car had been sitting there for so long without any gas that there wasn't too much fuel to actually explode. It was enough to send pieces of shrapnel flying into the road or pieces of glass into the car parked near Christine, though, and it would certainly have been strong enough to cause me some serious damage if I'd actually approached like I had planned to. And soon the cops showed up, as did the fire department, and the vehicle's blaze was extinguished. Over the next few days, we learned that the fire had definitely been arson. A small hole had been drilled through the glass of one of Christine's windows, a tiny bit of accelerant had been poured through it, and then someone had fed a burning rag into the car. Now finally, the cops and the city council put up some effort into tracking Christine's owner, and this went absolutely nowhere. As it turned out, the license plate was just completely fake, registered to no vehicle on record, and the only thing they were able to trace was the engine, which belonged to a totally different, much older car that had been supposedly scrapped many years before. Now, there's no way Christine would have been able to drive at all with that engine installed, and the whole thing was just some mystery. Nobody had any idea when the car had turned up or what the purpose of all of it really was. Had the vandalism been some kind of preamble in order to burn Christine for some purpose? Some of us half expected the cops to find a charred body in the trunk, but there was nothing like that. The wreckage of the car got towed, and from that day forward, the vehicular vandalism just kind of stopped. Various other things happened with the neighborhood watch since then. I confronted a burglar, and one of my neighbors helped the cops arrest an SA offender on the run, and we successfully chased off a gang of drug dealers who'd started operating on the corner. But nothing ever came close to being as puzzling and mysterious or creepy as that series of vehicular vandalism and the mysterious Christine, the impossible car. Now, it's been nearly a decade since then, and I still think about it from time to time. At the very least, I wish I knew who had been responsible for the vandalism and how they'd been able to slip under my nose quite so successfully. But I guess some mysteries just never end up getting solved. I'm gonna start this by saying that I love the idea of the Neighborhood Watch Initiative. I've moved house since this story took place, and I'm part of an unofficial neighborhood watch myself. I regularly help out, and I'd say that I'm a proud member. Now, it wasn't always the case. I used to live in a small ranch-style house in a relatively rural neighborhood. I didn't know much about the concept of neighborhood watch groups at the time, and even less so about the type of neighborhood watch group in my area. I don't really want to name the group or explain who they were because it'll open up a can of worms, but let's just say that they were a specific type of neighborhood watch group where all the members were of a certain heritage, which I was not, and therefore I was never invited to join or be any part of their group. But within a day of moving in, I did receive a surprisingly professional-looking pamphlet detailing who they were and what they did. In short, they kept an eye on the neighborhood for undesirables, bad behavior, and any threat to their way of life. My vague understanding of a neighborhood watch group was that they were a group of people who kept an eye out for crime or vandalism, but that didn't seem to be the case here. It seemed more like a homeowners association, but they were adamant in their literature that they were a neighborhood watch group. And boy, did they send a lot of literature. Almost every week I received a Neighborhood Watch newsletter, but these mostly consisted of lists of things I should or shouldn't do as a good member of the community. The pamphlets I received seemed specifically designed for people like me, i.e. people who didn't quite fit in to their culture. I don't want to say that they were outright hostile, but they made it very clear that I didn't entirely belong and I wasn't one of them. I had no idea which of my neighbors actually belonged to this Neighborhood Watch group, but almost every neighbor I tried to befriend or even be remotely friendly with seemed to snub me or look down on me. They were all a fair bit older than me, with the youngest pushing 50 aside from a small handful of families who kept to themselves. And there was one neighbor I befriended though. I'll just call him Devin. Now he was a black guy who had lived in the neighborhood with his wife until she tragically passed away a couple of years ago. We became buddies, and I soon found out that he'd been made to feel as ostracized by the Neighborhood Watch as I had. And according to Devin, they'd barely even offered sympathy when his wife had passed. Their biggest concern seemed to be informing him that if he was holding the wake at home, he'd have to limit how many cars parked in the street because otherwise it might become inconvenient for the others. Now I was horrified at this. The man had just lost his wife, and the Neighborhood Watch, as they called himself, were concerned that too many people might want to support him and pay their respects. And so we kind of bonded over how much of a bunch of expletives this Neighborhood Watch group was. Now we took to calling them the homeowners a-holes. Anytime either of us did end up speaking to one of the members of the Neighborhood Watch, particularly a very elderly man called Elijah, we intentionally referred to them as a homeowners association after realizing how much they seemed to irrationally anger them. Now, it wasn't long before I started receiving personalized letters on their pretentious customized Neighborhood Watch letterhead complaining about various things. My lawn needed trimming, my car was parked too far from the curb, and I should only ever park in my driveway, never mind the fact that I was applying new asphalt at the time. Now, I wrote back informing them that this seemed like something an HOA should be concerned with, not a Neighborhood Watch group, especially one of their persuasion, and shouldn't they be on the lookout for crimes and vandalism? Mike's garden shed had been broken into a few weeks before, and there certainly hadn't been any Neighborhood Watch keeping an eye then. They didn't respond to this, but 2 weeks later, I received another letter informing me that an untoward-looking gentleman had been seen on my property on multiple evenings. Now, this confused me at first until I realized that they were talking about Mike, their own neighbor. Now, we couldn't outright come out and accuse them of racism because they never specified details of who they were talking about other than saying he appeared suspicious. But you know, it wasn't hard to read between the lines. I think I was angrier about this than Mike was. I guess he was used to the neighbors being kind of hostile, which he said had been going on ever since he and his Iranian wife moved in. As an Iranian guy myself, this made me even more angry for a bunch of reasons, and Mike really had to work hard to calm me down. And that's when he hit me with the news. He was moving out in 3 months. Now, I was kind of mad at him. He was going to leave me with these people who clearly didn't want us here. And that's when he suggested that I sell up and, for the time being, move in with him as his roommate. Now, it felt kind of juvenile, as men in our late 20s and early 30s respectively, but Mike was moving to my dream city, San Francisco, and I had family there. It wasn't actually a bad idea, so it was decided. We'd leave this weird, creepy Neighborhood Watch cult in our rearview mirror and move out. And that's when things got really crazy. I started receiving notes again on the Neighborhood Watch letterheads, and this time they were accusing me of running a meth lab in the basement. At first, that's all they were, statements and accusations. And then they escalated. I could call the cops and shut you down, but I won't. Not yet. That kind of thing. And the next, I received an ultimatum telling me to shut the meth lab down or something terrible would happen. Now, this was all insane. Obviously, I was not running a meth lab in my basement, and the biggest piece of evidence in my defense was that I did not even have a basement. I guess some of the other houses in the spread-out neighborhood did, and whoever was accusing me of this was one of those basement owners. Presumably he, or she, assumed my house was just the same. I showed Mike, and what started off as a kind of joke soon turned pretty scary. We were counting down the days until the move, just 6 weeks now. And that's when I got the most terrifying letter yet. still written on neighborhood watch letterhead paper, and the writing was scrawled, erratic, and somewhat mental. The writer threatened that if I didn't shut my meth lab down within a week, which I was clearly running with a friend, who the author identified with a slur that I won't repeat here, then both of our houses were going to be cleansed by holy fire, quote unquote. Mike and I debated whether this was a metaphor or something more. Our question was answered when the hedge bordering my front yard was set ablaze in the middle of the night. The next morning, after a sleepless night and some wonderful aid from the fire department, I was met with another insane note claiming that this was a taste of what we were to expect. Now, obviously, I informed the cops at this point. They took all the notes for evidence just in case they could find any trace fingerprints, and I made photocopies before the cops took them and decided enough was enough. I was going to confront the leader of the neighborhood watch, a man I'd thus far completely avoided, and his name is Samuel. Now, with Mike as backup, we went storming over to Samuel's house. Now, the wind was knocked out of our sails a little when the door was answered by his adorable daughter who invited us in. And then, Samuel's wife offered us hot drinks and cookies, and it was like cultural whiplash. Eventually, Samuel arrived home from his round of golf and sent the family away. We confronted him with the letters, angrily thrusting them right at his face, and we hit him with everything. How the neighbors had made us all feel unwelcome, how this kind of insanity was not the type of thing a neighborhood watch should be engaging in, and we asked if the organization was even registered with the local police or officials in any way. All the while, Samuel was just sitting there, quietly taking in our rage as he read over the notes. And when he was done, he looked at us with a face as pale as a ghost, and to his credit, he admitted that he and the neighbors had felt like myself, Mike, and his wife had not been the best fit for the neighborhood. He admitted that the pamphlets we were sent were intentionally hostile, that there were a number of neighbors, particularly the old folks, who like to keep things culturally insular. Now, I'd just like to reiterate at this point that this wasn't a regular sort of white thing. It wasn't even just a group of white people just trying to drive us out. It was a lot more complex than that, but I don't want to go into the whole story here due to the current events. I'll just leave it up to you to decide what I'm talking about, but it wasn't a case of random white people acting hostile towards BIPOC folk. It was weirder than that, which is all I'll say on the matter. Now back to Samuel. He swore blind on his faith and his family that he had no knowledge of these handwritten, threatening notes and had no idea who sent them. I believed him. He'd been so bluntly honest with us to that point that I had no reason not to. Now, Mike was less convinced, but I managed to persuade him. The one thing that did disturb us both was when Samuel said he had an idea and that both Mike and I should be very, very careful. He asked if there was any way we could escalate our move. When we told him there wasn't and that we were locked in for the next 6 weeks, Samuel told us to leave everything with him. Remember the old man Elijah who I mentioned earlier? Well, he died of a heart attack 3 days after we confronted Samuel, and the note stopped. The neighbors started being more friendly towards us, so much so in fact that some of them went out of their way to bring Mike and I these delicious food dishes, and Samuel invited us for dinner multiple times. Mike was still suspicious and didn't accept invites, but I at least tried to play nice with Samuel. Mostly I was curious to dig into what might have happened with Elijah. Samuel never let anything slip. He was a very slippery, intelligent character, but he dropped enough hints for me to know that Elijah had been the one sending the notes and that maybe, just maybe, his little heart attack had been a lot more convenient than coincidental. All in all, it was like living in Twin Peaks or the Twilight Zone. I was extremely happy to get out of there with Mike. Now, I stayed with him for around 6 months before moving into a place of my own with a wonderful woman that I met in Frisco who I'm now proud to call my wife. We live in the city, and Mike lives nearby, and there's absolutely no official neighborhood watch to speak of. We all just look out for each other and act like good neighbors to each other. And that's all you need, really. The rest can work under the right circumstances, but when a group of people like our former neighborhood watch get together, there's a danger that it can spawn folks like Elijah who take things way too far, or people like Samuel who in many ways were the most chilling characters of them all, even if his actions might have saved us in the end. Frankly, I just don't want to meet any of them again, or any of their ilk. I'm pretty happy with my diverse melting pot of city neighbors, thank you very much. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, go to San Francisco to get yourself a poop needle.